Good morning. The famously witty New York philosopher Sidney Morgenbesser, who for many years taught at Columbia University, was one day leaving a subway station. As he ascended the steps, he put his pipe in his mouth. A police officer stopped him and told him that there was no smoking on the subway. Morgenbesser pointed out that he was leaving the subway, not going into it, and that, in any case, he hadn't yet lit his pipe. Realizing that he was snookered, but trying to preserve his authority, the cop tried a different tack. "If I let you do it," he said, "I'd have to let everyone do it." Morgenbesser shot back. "Who do you think you are, Kant?" Unfortunately, due to his correct German pronunciation, the name Kant was mistaken for a vulgar epithet, and poor Sidney Morgenbesser was hauled off to the police station. He won his freedom only after a colleague showed up and patiently explained the categorical imperative to the unamused cops. Now, here to explain the categorical imperative to you guys is our second guest lecturer of the semester, Tim Stoll. Once again, I couldn't think of a better man for the job. Tim, who holds a PhD in philosophy from Princeton and is now working here as a departmental lecturer, is something of an expert on Kant's philosophy. Though Tim's primary scholarly interest is 19th century German philosophy, much of his work on that period focuses on the reception of Immanuel Kant's thought. For example, Tim has written about the influence of Kant's aesthetics on Friedrich Schiller and on Friedrich Nietzsche, and he's currently at work on a number of papers on Arthur Schopenhauer, one of Kant's most important successors. So you couldn't be in better hands today. Take it away, Tim.
Good morning, everyone. In our last lecture, we saw that Kant's goal in the first section of the groundwork is to arrive at some provisional conclusions about the nature of moral obligation by analyzing our common sense conception of morality. His conclusions in that section are broadly twofold. First, that actions possessing genuine moral worth are actions done from the motive of duty or out of respect for the law, as he also says. And second, that what the law itself tells us is that we should act only on maxims that can be universalized. Kant's goal in the second section is to extract from that provisional analysis a more precise conception of the supreme principle of morality, and one which can be employed in our everyday reasoning about what to do in particular cases. Kant does this by providing us with three, or somewhat confusingly and annoyingly 5, depending on how you count, formulas of the categorical imperative. You'll see these to the side of me on the screen. In today's lecture, what I want to do is focus specifically on 2 of these, the so-called formula of humanity and the formula of universal law. But before we get on to that, we need to familiarize ourselves with another bit of Kantian technical jargon, which is employed throughout groundwork 2. This is the distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So what does Kant mean by an imperative? And what's the difference between an imperative's being hypothetical and categorical? Basically, you can think of an imperative as a practical rule telling you that rationally you ought to act in some way or other. As Kant expresses the point, all imperatives are expressed by an ought and indicate by this the relation of an objective law of reason to a will. They say that to do or to omit something would be good. The terms hypothetical and categorical are derived from the logical vocabulary of Kant's day, in which they indicate a particular logical form of certain statements or propositions. You can think of the distinction in the following manner. Hypothetical imperatives have if-then or conditional form. These are characteristic of what we sometimes call means-end reasoning. If you want a cup of coffee, then you should heat water, or if you want a passing grade in Phi 202, you should do the assigned readings. Those are examples of hypothetical imperatives. The important point to note about them is that they are, as Kant puts it, only conditionally binding. In other words, you only need to perform the action that the imperative commands under the condition that you have a particular aim, for example, making coffee or passing Phi 202. Categorical imperatives, by contrast, tell you that you should perform an action simpliciter, or just period. They're not conditional in the same way that a hypothetical imperative is. They tell you that an action is necessary no matter what, under all circumstances. Now, Kant takes it as obvious that whatever else it might be, morality is a system of rules for regulating our behavior. It's a system of imperatives, in other words. And so the question arises, are these imperatives hypothetical or categorical in nature? And Kant thinks the answer to this question is again quite clear. They're obviously categorical, he says. If you just consider paradigm instances of moral commands, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie, you can see that they are categorical, at least at first glance. The prescription, thou shalt not lie, just tells us don't lie. It doesn't tell us don't lie if you want your friends to like you or something like that. As Kant puts the point, the categorical imperative alone has the tenor of a practical law. Having settled then the question of the form of moral imperatives, Kant can move on to the question of their content. In other words, instead of asking how moral imperatives command, to which the answer is categorically, he's now interested in asking what they command. And this, of course, is really the main goal of section 2. As I mentioned earlier, the answer to this question is given by the 3 formulas of the categorical imperative. The first of these will be familiar to you already from last week's reading. It says, quote, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. In the literature on Kant, this is sometimes referred to as the formula of universal law, or FUL as short, and I'll be referring to it as such going forward. Okay. As a reminder, a maxim you can think of as essentially a generalized description of an agent's action, together with their intention or their aim in acting. You could think of it, in other words, as the general sort of policy on which the agent is acting. So the formula of universal law then provides us with a sort of test for maxims. If we want to determine whether an action is right or wrong, we think about whether the maxim or policy of the action could be universally adopted. If so, then the action is permissible, and if not, the action is impermissible. That's all fairly abstract, so let's see how this looks in practice by considering Kant's own very famous example of the lying promise. So suppose Bill is in dire need of money. He knows that his friend Sally can help him out, but he foresees that Sally will be unlikely to do so unless she believes that Bill is going to pay her back. So Bill decides to lie, telling Sally that he will pay her back so that he can get the money, although he has no intention of doing so. The maxim of Bill's action, Kant suggests, is something like this. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that this will never happen. So what do you think? Can this maxim be universalized? Why don't you pause the video and take a moment to refer to your text and see if you can determine what Kant would say about a maxim like this. Hint, you can find the answer on Academy page 422. So, can Bill's maxim be universalized? Well, Kant thinks the answer is quite clearly no. How does he argue for this? Well, imagine a world in which the generally accepted policy was to tell lies whenever you happen to be in need of money. This would be a world, Kant supposes, in which lies told in such circumstances would virtually never be believed. Presumably, he's assuming that everyone knows that this is the general policy. But in order for it to make sense to adopt lying as a means to getting money, I need to have some assurance that my lie will be believed, right? Otherwise, what would be the point? So the effect in this case of universalizing the maxim appears to be that the whole rationale for performing the action in the first place is undermined. Pretty clever argument. So, is that it? Kant's found the supreme principle of morality, and we can stop moral philosophy right there? Not so fast. There's a classic objection to Kant's the procedure for testing maxims that is laid out by the formula of universal law, which is referred to often as the problem of false negatives and false positives. The problem is that applying the formula of universal law seems to rule some obviously permissible actions as impermissible, and some obviously impermissible actions as permissible. So, in short, the procedure for testing maxims given to you by the formula of universal law does not seem to get the right answers in all cases. So let's consider two examples of this. First, suppose that I have the maxim, I will buy an electric guitar, but never sell one. This maxim is pretty clearly as innocuous as they come, right? Surely it's permissible. But it looks as though it can't be universalized. After all, a world in which everyone buys an electric guitar, but there's nobody selling them, is in some clear sense inconceivable. So the formula of universal law seems to imply that buying an electric guitar without the intention of ever selling one is morally impermissible. And that is surely absurd, you might think. Second, it seems as though we can avoid the contradiction in cases like the lying promise by creating gerrymandered maxims. It's a little bit of election humor for you there. Suppose that I'm considering telling a lie for the purposes of securing a loan, right? Suppose also that the lie is told on September 29th, 2020, to a person wearing a pink polka-dotted shirt. Nothing that Kant says prevents me from describing my maxim as follows. I will lie on September 29th, 2020, to someone in a pink polka-dotted shirt when I am in need of money. This should still be impermissible, it seems. However, it doesn't obviously generate the kind of conflict that occurs in the original lying promise example. In particular, because the maxim is so hyper-specific, we might doubt whether it would, even upon universalization, become well known enough by everyone to make it impossible for me to achieve my end. Since the initial publication of Kant's Groundwork, most readers have tended to assume that the formula of universal law represents the definitive statement of the categorical imperative. As we've just seen, the test which this formula proposes faces its share of problems. It's also given readers the impression, and perhaps it's given you the impression as well, that Kantian morality is bizarrely impersonal. To many, it's seemed that the theory requires us to respond to the value of some abstract law rather than to the value of individual persons. When we turn to Kant's second formulation, the so-called formula of humanity, however, I think things look rather different. There are even good reasons for thinking that It's this formula, the formula of humanity, that Kant himself really cares most deeply about. And in fact, in the writings published after the Groundwork on moral philosophy, it's the second formula that Kant tends to rely on most frequently. So what does the formula of humanity tell us? And how does Kant arrive at it? As Kant phrases it at Academy page 4429, the formula of humanity says, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Before we talk about the argument that Kant gives for this principle, let's try to get clear on what the formula itself is supposed to be telling us. First of all, note that humanity, as Kant uses the term, doesn't refer to a biological category. He doesn't mean membership, say, in the human species. Rather, the term humanity is meant to be more or less equivalent with rational nature. It's sort of what we might mean when we speak of persons or personhood. So if God exists, or if there's intelligent extraterrestrial life somewhere in the universe, they would instantiate humanity every bit as much as human beings. And Kant was a big believer in aliens. Very important to keep in mind. We can appreciate, I think, the immediate force of this second principle by considering slavery. Certainly one of the most appalling moral wrongs that can be perpetrated on another human being. The slave owner, after all, treats the slave quite literally as a tool, as a mere means for the realization of his own ends. As far as the slave owner is concerned, the slave might as well be an inanimate object. And it's this way of treating another person, Kant would suggest, that appalls us. Intuitively, I think there's something quite right about this idea. What's wrong about slavery isn't just, as the utilitarian might suppose, that it causes human beings untold suffering, though certainly it does that as well, but that it is dehumanizing. It robs us of our humanity, treats us as mere things rather than persons to be respected. Okay, so much for an initial gloss on the formula of humanity. How does Kant argue for it? Well, the argument comes at Academy page 4428. Why don't you take another moment here to look at the text and see if you can come up with a general idea of how the argument is supposed to proceed. Here's a way in which we might try to reconstruct Kant's argument in 4 steps. Premise 1, all imperatives have an end, or something for the sake of which they tell us to act. Premise 2, an immediate conclusion from the first premise, the categorical imperative also has an end, or something for the sake of which it tells us to act. Premise 3, since the categorical imperative is necessary and universal, binding on all rational agents, its end would have to be, quote, something the existence of which has an absolute worth, something which is an end in itself. Let's pause for a moment over this more complicated premise. What Kant seems to mean by something which is an end in itself, or something which has absolute worth, is at least 2 things. First, that the thing has intrinsic value, so its value is independent of any of the desires or inclinations that rational beings might have. And second, that it possesses a degree of value which is so great that it could override the value of any other possible end. So, why is this the only option for the end of the categorical imperative? And the thought seems to be that, well, only something of intrinsic value is something which we could expect all rational beings to recognize as an end. So it'd be the only thing that has universal appeal. And only something whose value was so great as to override the value of any other object would be something that we could expect to provide reasons for action for rational agents under all circumstances. Okay? Premise 4, then, in premise 4, Kant asserts that the only possible candidate for such an end is humanity. Kant provides an additional argument for this premise, which proceeds by way of elimination. I think it's a good exercise to take a careful look at that part of the argument and see, first, whether Kant considers all the possible alternatives for something of absolute worth, and second, whether the alternatives that he does consider are successfully ruled out. In any event, it seems to follow from these 4 premises that the categorical imperative can be formulated as the formula of humanity. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, hang on, isn't Kant constantly pounding the table, saying that the categorical imperative isn't conditional on any ends? Isn't the categorical imperative supposed to tell us to perform certain actions, period, not because of any good that they might realize? So why is he now speaking as if moral actions are directed towards an end after all? The answer to this question can be found on Academy page 4437. And it provides a nice illustration about the way in which we should think about the nature of moral motivation on Kant's view. So here, Kant distinguishes between 2 sorts of ends, which he calls ends to be affected and independently existing ends. So what does this distinction come to? Ends to be affected are things or states of affairs that don't yet exist, but are brought about by our actions. So like the cup of coffee or the state of affairs in which you find yourself receiving a passing grade for Phi 202. These are the sorts of ends that are characteristic of hypothetical imperatives. Existent ends, by contrast, are things which we view as having a certain sort of inner worth, which demands that we treat them in a certain way, say by showing them respect or working to preserve them. They're ends which already exist. We don't bring them into existence through our actions. Nevertheless, they place limits on the way in which it's appropriate for us to behave, at least if we recognize them as existing ends. So let's take a couple of examples to see if this distinction tracks some intuitive part of our ordinary moral reasoning. Suppose that an especially perverse individual breaks into the Vatican Museum at night and defaces Michelangelo's frescoes on the Sistine ceiling. Intuitively, this person has done something wrong. But the wrong, I think, isn't just that they've made it temporarily impossible for others to enjoy looking at the frescoes. So it isn't just that they've prevented certain ends to be affected from coming into being. Rather, it also consists in their failure to treat the priceless work of art with the right sort of deference that it merits. Take another, perhaps simpler example. Consider the action of placing your hand on your heart when you hear the national anthem. That action is end-directed in one sense. There's a reason why we perform it. But it doesn't seem to be directed at realizing anything. Rather, the function of the action is simply to signify a certain sort of attitude, again, perhaps of respect, which someone might believe is owed to this particular piece of music or what it represents. Okay? So similarly, although much more importantly then, in the case of human beings, treating them as ends means displaying our respect for them, and in particular, displaying our respect for them by refraining to treat them in certain ways. More specifically, we could say that for Kant, having respect for a person means viewing their aims and purposes as placing limits on the pursuit of my own aims and purposes. This is based on the idea that Kant brings up towards the end of section 2, that autonomy, or the ability to decide for yourself which aims and ends you want to pursue, is, quote, the ground of the dignity of human nature. Moreover, we can say that, according to this view, an action has moral worth when it is done out of this attitude of respect for another human person. In closing, let's consider some of the advantages of Kant's formula of humanity and some of its potential limitations. First of all, the formula of humanity doesn't seem to be subject to the problem of false positives and false negatives in the same way that FUL does. There's no problem, it seems, on the formula of humanity with buying an electric guitar but never having the intention to sell one, since this policy doesn't involve treating anyone merely as a means in any obvious way. Nor does the fact that I can gerrymander my maxims seem to pose any special difficulties. If Kant's right, and it's a big assumption, but if he is right that lying to a person is a way of treating them merely as a means, then I still treat them as a means no matter what their name is or what the date is or whatever they happen to be wearing. These sorts of ways of describing our maxims on more specific levels don't seem to change that fact. On the other hand, the formula of humanity might not be able to explain why we have the intuition that certain actions are obviously morally wrong. For example, it seems unable to account for the wrong involved, say, in inflicting unnecessary suffering on non-human animals. As Kant himself says in the midst of the argument for the formula of humanity, animals have, quote, only relative worth as means and are therefore called things. Now, we might, of course, admit that our obligations to animals, whatever they might be, are of a lower order than our obligations to other persons. Still, it seems wrong to suggest that the way we treat animals is a matter of total moral indifference, as Kant here seems to be implying. Moreover, since humanity is synonymous with rational nature for Kant, it's unclear what the formula implies about our obligations to human infants or very young children who have yet to develop their rational capacities. Does the mere fact that they will someday develop those capacities explain our obligations to them now? It's unclear. Finally, there's a question about the consistency of Kant's position in Groundwork 2. The formula of universal law and the formula of humanity, and the other formulas that we haven't considered in so much depth, are not meant to be distinct moral principles. They're simply meant to be different glosses on the single supreme principle of morality. As Kant says explicitly, to say that in the use of means to any end, I am to limit my maxim to the condition of its universal validity as a law for every subject, is tantamount to saying that the subject of ends, that is, the rational being itself, must be made the basis of all maxims of actions, never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. But if what we said a moment ago about false positives and false negatives is right, it seems that these two principles aren't equivalent after all, since they deliver different answers in different cases. So there's a lingering concern that Kant hasn't provided us with two or more ways of thinking about the same moral principle, but rather two or more distinct and in fact competing moral principles. So what do you all think? Which of Kant's various formulations of the categorical imperative is most appealing, if any of them are? Are they consistent with one another? Does Kant have any way of avoiding the problems of false positives and false negatives? I look forward to hearing your thoughts on these questions in the next town hall.